You got to get passionate about this thing. If the cross doesn't move you, nothing will move you.
I'm offering you something that's greater than silver and gold. I'm offering you something that's greater than an increase in your pay on your job. I'm offering you
There's no shortcuts to the glory.
We've got to get past week-to-week living. We've got to multiply our prayer life. We've got to multiply our effort.
When we are willing to give, God will always give it back to us in good measure that is pressed down, shaken together, and running over.
Hey, thanks for checking out our Christian Life Church podcast. You will be hearing from one of our pastors or guest speakers, either at our Frankfurt or Lebanon campus. Prepare your hearts and your minds to receive a word from God. Thanks for listening. Enjoy and receive this message.
Tonight. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. The writer said it like this: from the rising of the sun to the setting of the same, His name is to be praised. You know what that means? That means that sometimes it's going to be when things are going good. And there are going to be times you can rest assured that things are not going so good. And we have to learn this balance in our life to praise God no matter where we find ourselves. Am I talking to anybody tonight? Sometimes it's everything that we can do just to come into the house of God and to find the strength to raise our hands. Has anybody ever been there? Listen, Sister Jenna, first of all, let's give this praise team a great big hand. Ushered us into the presence of the Lord tonight. But she said it right. She said, has anybody had one of those weeks? Well, I've had one of those weeks already. And I can't wait for Friday to get here. And it's just been one of those, it's been a fight this week. And there were times where I had to check myself, and I could have just kind of gotten down and said, man, things can't get any worse. But there had to be something that rose in me, Sister Nancy, that said, He's still God whether or not things go wrong in my life. You got a grandbaby in the hospital right now, but God's still God. God is still able. Come on, somebody. God can still do it. God can still make something great out of a mess. You can be seated tonight. I'm glad that we serve a God like our God. He's just amazing. He's just amazing. Tonight, I want to speak into your hearing for just a little while, and I will try to not belabor the point, but there's a point that I do want to make tonight, and I believe that if all of us catch it, that it can help us in our walk with life. How many know that we need help? We need help. We need help. We can't do this life on our own. And if we try, we make a mess out of it. And so tonight, I want to help somebody, and I want to bring a concept to you that I think that so many times we overlook. And so we'll just see what happens tonight. Matthew chapter 14. I want to springboard into what I'd like to talk to you about tonight. Matthew chapter 14 and verse number 19. And the word of the Lord says this: and He commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, and took 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And looking up to heaven, He blessed and brake and gave the loaves to His disciples, and His disciples to the multitude. And verse number 20 says, and they did all eat. Everybody say all. They did all eat and were filled. Everybody say filled. And they took up of the fragments that remained 12 baskets full. Verse number 21, and they that had eaten. Now, we talk about that God fed 5,000, which in all reality, that is not accurate. It was far greater than 5,000 because the Bible says that they had eaten, all that had eaten were about 5,000 men beside women and children. And so tonight, what I want to speak to you is a principle, and I will just call this the principle of abundance. The principle of abundance. Most, if not all of us here believe that what God does, He does on such a level of perfection. No matter what He does, no matter what He chooses to do or how He chooses to move, it's exact. God doesn't do anything halfway. God does not lead us into a situation to leave us there. He doesn't look from afar when we have made a mess out of life and say, well, you've made your bed, now you have to lie in it. The biggest misconception that I think that we as human beings develop is the fact that we are going through, pardon the expression, we are going through hell on earth. I must have done something wrong. And God is punishing me for what I have done. And I just want to pause for a second and say that I don't believe that God works that way. I don't believe that we serve a God who is just waiting for the moment that we mess up in order to punish us for the decisions that we have made or for the mess that we've made. But I do believe that we serve a God that is standing on the sidelines, and when we do mess up, because we do and we will continue to do so, but He is standing on the sidelines and He is there to pick us up when we fall. I don't know of any parent anywhere in this world, any parent worth their weight in gold, that just waits for their children to mess up. I don't know. I think as parents we do, we know when our kids make the wrong decisions and the wrong choice, and we do say, we use it as a learning experience and say, well, I thought that it might have turned out this way. But I don't know of any parent worth their weight in gold that is just waiting for a moment that their child messes up so that they can harshly correct them. That's never going to work. And the same is true of God. He is never going to do that. He is a just, He is a faithful God. He is there to pick us up. He is there to bear the weight when we can't bear the weight. So everything that God does is exact. If you don't believe that, then just consider the placement of our planet in the vast void of space. I was talking with Brother Andrew last night at practice. He is, and I am too, we are kind of ate up with this whole SpaceX thing, and it's just the coolest thing in the world. Space intrigues me, but we are placed 93 million miles away from the sun, yet the earth is exactly situated so that we don't burn up. Now, try to convince somebody of that here in about a month or so when everything's freezing. But consider, though, the axis of the earth, if it were just a few degrees off, then life would not be possible on earth. Consider the moon, even in the great expanse of space, is the closest to the earth. And on the dark side of the moon, we see the light side. We know that temperatures on the light side of the moon can reach 257 degrees. But on the dark side of the earth, temperatures drop to 387 degrees below zero. And we could not survive in that type of environment. So God placed us in a different position. The earth has an atmosphere that acts as a buffer to the extreme temperature of the sun, yet it traps enough heat that it can keep us warm at night. There again, come tomorrow, let's talk about that. But it makes it possible for us to live and to breathe. Our tolerance as human beings is very narrow and it's very fine. And just a shift here or there would make life totally different for all of us. And without artificial means, you and I cannot venture too far from the surface of the earth and survive. In fact, there are places on our planet that you can climb. Why anybody would want to do it, I don't understand. But without artificial means, you could not survive. I like aviation, and I know that anything above 12,000 feet is void of enough oxygen that you could ever survive. And I know that even in summer when we are burning up, you get up about 18,000 degrees, even in the dead of summer, it's below zero all the time. Do you think that God did not give thought to us? And so in times of difficulty and in times of despair, we have the audacity to wonder and to fret, does God even consider me? Does God even care about me? And with everything that I just read to you or just brought to you, it tells us that with every little minute, Sister Mary, detail of life, God has given it thought. And when it comes to our life and everything that we may go through, don't you think for a minute that God would ever turn his head on you and say, well, you made your bed and now you're going to have to lie in it. No, but God has gone before us and he has mapped out our life, and he is saying, if you will just trust in me, then everything is going to be okay. Everything is going to be all right. The vast depth of the ocean has not yet been explored because the artificial means that it would take to explore does not even exist. Aiden and I will be 2 years ago in this coming March, went to the Philippines, and I'm very intrigued. I watched the map in the airplane the entire way. I saw as we skirted Russia, and I kept thinking, let's stay a little more south than we are right now if we could. But we flew over the Mariana Trench, which is fascinating to me. It is a trench in the western Pacific Ocean just east of the Philippines. It is 1,580 miles long and 40 miles wide. They are the deepest waters on earth. They reach the depth of 36,037 feet. Approximately 5 or 6 miles deep. More than 7,000 feet deeper than Mount Everest is tall. So God created everything with an exactness that affords us the opportunity and the ability to live and survive in our beautiful world. God knows exactly what he's doing. He is so exact in everything that he does. So when we read Matthew chapter 14, and we read in, you can turn and you can read it in Mark 6, Luke 9, we read the account of a significant miracle that Jesus performed when he fed the multitude. Many of the things that Jesus did only appears in 1 or 2 of the Gospels, but all 4 writers of the Gospels thought this event significant enough that they all recorded it. What took place in a grassy field so long ago made an incredible impression in the minds of all four authors that they wrote about a boy's lunch of 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now stay with me for just a second. I'm just springboarding in where I want to go. The crowd gathered to hear Jesus teach. And understand, I'm going to cover a lot of ground here. They weren't close to any fast food restaurants. There was no Burger King. They weren't close to any town where they could just go hop down the road and get enough food that would be needed to feed such a multitude of people. And the disciples begin to talk about it, and Jesus began to talk about it because they realized the need of the people. And they realized that if these people were going to stay and hear Jesus, that at some point they were going to need food. And they gave it, Brother Alfonso, enough thought that they began to ask one another, what are we going to do? And the story goes that there was a lad who was present who had a sack lunch, and one of the disciples, as the rest of them contemplated what to do, one of the disciples brought to the attention of Jesus, I know it's not much, but I found a boy that has a little bit of food. And where most of us would have just gone and never looked twice, but Jesus took the fishes, the 2 fish and the 5 loaves. The Bible said that he blessed it, he broke it, and then he gave it to his disciples, who in turn began to divide it among the crowd. And as they walked through the crowd dispensing the food, the miracle was taking place right before their eyes. Because as they gathered that handful of fish and that other handful of bread that could only carry so much, and as they begin to distribute it, as they begin to rip pieces off, and they would say, here's some food for you, and here's some food for you. When they got down, Brother Stan, to that last little bit, and they distributed it, they looked down in their hands, and their hands were full once again. Pretty amazing story. And as they began to feed the multitude, what was just a handful to start with, yet everywhere they went, they still had a handful of food. And they continued to give it out. Every time they broke it, every time they gave it, it was in their hand again. It was as if it had never been given in the first place. 3 of the 4 Gospels give the number of men, and I've already stated it, but that would be 5,000 beside the women and children. I've heard people say, and I've heard people preach, and I've read commentaries that say that there actually would have been somewhere around 25,000 people present that day. And 25,000 or so people fed with 2 fish and 5 loaves. But I would like to take a focus on what I would like to take a focus on, let me say it that way, is not what was distributed. Rather, I want to focus on what was left over. Because the Bible says, and they took up the fragments that remained, 12 baskets full. It would have been extremely precise for Jesus to have fed 25,000 people, and yet there only be just enough left over to fill 12 baskets. Incredible that he could cut it so close. Think about all the banquets that you've been to here at the church. I know every time we have a dinner, after everybody has gone through the line, some go back for seconds, and yes, some of you go back for thirds. We've seen you. But my point is that there is always food left over. Here at CLC, there's always enough that we say, please take some food home with you. Would you like a pie? Would you like some barbecue for lunch for the next 5 days? Would you please take it home and eat it later? But it is a miracle in itself that there was such a small portion of food left over. It was precise, but it wasn't really exact. So, did Jesus miscalculate? There's a question. Did he miss it just a little bit? Was he a little off in what he thought the crowd needed? Also interesting was that there were 12 baskets and there were 12 disciples. Now, I looked at a commentary, and the commentary said that I always think, when I hear a story, I paint a mental picture and I try to see it, try to put myself there. And I imagine disciples with these big, Chelsea had these big baskets, like a bushel basket, if you would. But this commentator, now whether or not he knows exactly, he takes the stance of that the baskets that they would have had would have been more like a sling type basket that would go around your neck to carry some valuable, some things with you, or more rather like a purse size basket. Whether or not that is, I don't know. But all I do know is that the Bible says that there were 12 baskets that were filled with what was left over. Did he overshoot the mark, or was he as exact as always? Did he misjudge the amount that was needed, or is he revealing a subtle principle to us? And I believe that he is. Think with me, if you will. Let's say that your family is a farming family from Palestine back in that day, and in the days of King Solomon, and it was a very peaceful and a prosperous time, the Bible tells us. There wasn't much happening in the way of warring. The economy was booming. Things were good. And think with me that you figure that your family could live on $15,000 a year. You could pay your bills, you could provide your family, or provide for your family and feed your family for $15,000, and that would be all you need to take care of your family and perhaps have a little left over. And suppose that your primary crop was corn, so you figure how much corn you would need to grow in order to be able to sell for the amount that would add up to $15,000 in order to secure your family's future for that year. And based on how much corn you needed, you would figure out how many acres you would have to have in order to grow that much corn. Now, if you were a Hebrew, though, you would not stop at the amount that you needed, but you would make sure that you planted more than you needed. If you needed 20 acres, then you would plant 23 acres just to make sure everything was covered. You would make sure that you had a surplus at the end of harvest. Why is that? Not because you wanted more money. Not because you wanted to buy more things, or you wanted a nicer chariot, or you wanted to add on to your house. Why? That lesson, the answer to that lesson is found in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 9 and 10. Hear this. And when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of the field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings or the leftovers of the harvest. Verse 10, and thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard, but thou shalt leave them for the poor and stranger. Gleaning is simply a practice of collecting leftover crops from fields that have already been harvested. He is saying, what Leviticus was saying is, don't go back into the field and find a few leftover crops and take those as well. But you were to leave those for the ones who were less fortunate than you. You were to leave those crops for those that did not have money to buy food, those that lived on the streets, those who were vagabonds, those who were homeless. You were to leave the corners and the leftovers for others. God said that you are to leave something for those who do not possess lands of plenty like you do. They also should benefit like you do in times of harvest. I want you to plant and to have an abundance. I want you to plant more, though, than you expect to personally benefit from. It is a simple principle. This was the very principle, understand, that brought Ruth and Boaz together. Ruth is the destitute daughter-in-law of Naomi. Ruth is a Moabite. She is a type of the world, and she stands outside of the promise of God for his people. But on the flip side, Boaz is a kinsman redeemer. Boaz is a type of Christ. Boaz is a type of the church. It is Boaz's adherence to the law in Leviticus that brings his future bride to his field. It was the abundance in Boaz's field. It was because he followed the teaching and the law, and it was because he left the corners of the fields. Ruth was attracted to the field because of abundance. Everybody say abundance. Had there not been an abundance in the field of Boaz, they would never have met. That is how exact and precise that God works. We can all look back to situations and times in our lives that had it not been this way, and had that not been a chance meeting, then things would have turned out completely different. I think back, and I'll laugh about this, to when I met my wife in 1998. It's a long time ago. I met her at a conference. We were to leave the day after Christmas, and I was not going to go. I wasn't going to go at all, and I didn't want to go, had no interest at all, and my cousin begged me, and I finally told him, I said, if you will shut your mouth and leave me alone, I'll go. I just want you to stop. You're pestering me. And so we went, left the day after Christmas, and I walked into that first service, and this choir was singing, and I didn't realize it, but Cheryl was in that choir, and we walked in, and we sat through the preaching, and the choir got up and sung at the end, and at the end, everybody dispersed. And as I was talking to everybody that I knew, I looked up, and I said, Rich, who is that? He said, that's Cheryl. I've never seen Cheryl. Well, she's been introduced me. And so that night, I called home and I said, Mom, this sounds weird, but I think I met my wife tonight. It's a funny, neat story to me, may not be to you, but had things not lined up, then my life could have turned out completely different. That is how exact God works. And we think that something happens for no apparent reason. And we think that things happen just by chance, and I just happen to be in the right place at the right time. But can I tell you that everything that you go through, God has ordained, and God has set things things in place. And when you get to that point, it's not because you've been good, it's not because you've been lucky, but it's because God has ordained that moment for you. The principle here is that the principle that I am speaking to you about, if we will grasp a hold of it, it will change our lives forever. I went to McDonald's yesterday. Yes, I like McDonald's. I like the McRib, actually. But yes. Can I get an amen back there in the back? Yeah. They say if you leave a McRib sit out for a year, at the end of the year, it'll still be the same. And I'm like, I don't care. It tastes great. Anyways, so I went into McDonald's yesterday morning, and I'm not a morning person. And so I don't like to go anywhere in the morning where people are cheery. I just can't handle it. I'm like, stay away from me. Don't talk to me. Don't look at me. So I went in, and there was a lady standing by the kiosk, and in my normal morning fashion, I walked in, she looked at me, I looked at her, and I went, and I walked on. I didn't want to talk, and so I stood beside her, and I placed my order, and there were two ladies that were standing in front of the kiosk. One lady was just the I don't know, she was the hostage, I think, is what it was. Because the other lady was vile. I mean, she was cursing. She said words that I have never even heard before. And I work construction. I've never heard that kind of talk in my life. And the more she talked, the madder I got. And I'm standing there, and I'm just looking straight ahead because I'm like, not today, devil. I'm not going to fall for this. And I'm just looking straight ahead. And she went into a rant, and it was like, girl, I can't. And then it was just expletives upon expletives. And I looked over, and I see out of the corner of my eye, the lady who's standing next to me, she's going, looking at me like, do something. And I'm like, and so I'm like, no, I'm not getting involved in this. I could, but I'm not going to. And then all of a sudden, she turns her attention to everybody that was working. Now listen, there's a table of morning regulars that is behind me, and they were talking. They got quiet, and so then she turns her attention to everybody that works at McDonald's, and she said, come on, people, let's get a move on. And then she proceeded to cuss them up one side and down the other. And I'm like, oh my Lord, how did I get in the middle of this? I thought Jerry Springer was somewhere around, but apparently he was not. And so the nice lady who's a manager who attends the Pilgrim Holiness Church, she turned around and she said, excuse me, we are short-handed today. And man, that set her off even more. She didn't care. And then finally somebody else came around and she said, ma'am, you can't talk to us like this. And I finally had enough. And I said, ma'am, we've heard enough from you. Could you kindly be quiet? And she began to turn her attention to me at that point. And I'm like, dear Lord, I just want a sausage and McMuffin, and I want my Coke. You couldn't tell I ate that, could you? And so she ends up storming off, and they said, don't come back. She said, I'll never be back. And with that, everybody began to clap and to cheer and to wish her a farewell in the entire restaurant. Oh my gosh. My point to that whole story, we want people to like us. As Christians, we got to put a smile on our face every once in a while. Everything out of our mouth cannot be negativity everywhere that we go, because it's not good for you and it's not good for anybody else. We want people to gravitate to us. And if we do, then we've got to speak positive words to people. You want to affect those around you, then lift people up. Don't tell people everything that's going wrong. Don't tell people that everything in my life. Walk and live in a place of abundance, and people will seek you out. They'll be nourished in your field when you live in a place of abundance. Good Lord, I got caught up on that. How do you live? How do we live in abundance? Well, in 1 Kings 17, Elijah told Ahab, or he tells Ahab rather, that it's not going to rain for years because the people are wicked. He said, you've caused Israel to sin, so my judgment against the nation is that I'm going to withhold rain. Then God speaks to Elijah and tells him to go to the brook Cherith, and there I will command the ravens to feed you. And this brook was a lonely place that was out in the middle of nowhere. And because of Ahab and Jezebel, they could have gotten their hands on him had he stayed in that area. They would have killed Elijah, so God hid Elijah. Listen how exact God ordained everything. He camped by this brook, and would you know it, that the brook that he thought was going to sustain him began to dry up. Everything around him started dying. Fields dried up. Land was devastated. And here is Elijah camped out in the wilderness by a dried up stream, and the ravens come by every day. And they bring him just enough that would sustain his life for that day. There was never a surplus. There was never an abundance. It was just the necessary things. And when the brook dried up, God had already designed a place for Elijah to go. And when God tells him that you're going to live in a certain place with a certain widow, what may have been thoughts in Elijah's mind of a better place with better conditions were quickly laid to rest. Because the fact of the matter is that they had to scrape the bottom, literally scrape the bottom of the barrel daily, every day, just to get enough to survive that day. For some of us, in our living for God and in our passage through life, it is a lot like that. There's not an abundance. In fact, for some, it's quite the opposite. There are some seasons of life where we find ourselves just scraping by, hoping that we have enough just to make it through the day. Can I tell you that we all, if we have not been in that situation, we're all going to find ourselves in that situation at some point, where it's just the fight for our lives. I'm not talking about scraping by materially, and that can happen, but I'm talking about when we get down to the bottom and we are just scraping by spiritually. And we come to church, Sister Paula, and we scrape the bottom of the barrel. There's no greater example of how to be faithful than you, Sister Paula. You for years, God has just provided for you enough. You've said He always gives me everything that I need. Can I tell you, we can all learn from that, because when we think that it's over for us, God will always come by. He may not give you everything that you want, but you can rest assured that God will give you everything that you need to survive what you are going through and in the place that you find yourself living. You talk to the backslider who walks away. And they will always tell you that I made bad decisions and things got bad. And I thought that God turned his back on me, only to find out that God was taking care of me the whole time. Because that's the kind of God that we serve. He ordains. He's got an ordained path for our life, and sometimes we take a detour. And God allows us to go places to hopefully get our attention back to where it needs to be. So day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, it's just enough to live. Every day, they get just enough oil, but they survive. And finally, when it's bad enough that the punishment has been enough on Israel, God calls Elijah and tells him to go to Mount Carmel and to challenge the people to decide once and for all who will serve him. And in 1 Kings 18, 23 and 24, the Bible says, "Let them therefore give us 2 bullocks, and let them choose 1 bullock for themselves and cut it in pieces." He's talking about the prophets of Baal. "Cut it in pieces and lay it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will dress the other bullock and lay it on wood, and I won't put any fire underneath it as well. And call ye on the name of your gods. And I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God that answereth by fire, let him be God." And all the people answered and said, "It is well spoken." So starting early in the morning, the 850 prophets of Baal did their thing and continued cutting themselves and calling out to their God who would never answer them. And now it's the afternoon and there's still no fire. And about the time of the evening sacrifice, the Bible lets us know, Elijah takes 12 stones and he builds an altar. Nothing fancy, very crude. He just stacks 12 stones together, one for each tribe of Israel. And he put wood on the altar. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was expected. That's what you would do. He kills the bullock. He spreads out the pieces on the wood, and everything was prepared just right. And up to this point, nothing extreme had been done. It was just business as usual. But now, at this point in the story, Elijah does something that would have been considered perhaps irrational. He called for a trench to be dug around the altar. You all know the story well. And he had 4 barrels of water brought and poured out on the sacrifice. He's asking, going to be praying for fire to come and consume, and he's pouring water on the sacrifice. And the water begins to run down the wood and the stones, and it begins to gather in the trench. And Elijah watches as it covers the sacrifice and begins to spill over onto the parched ground, because remember, it had not rained for 3 years. He tells the men, "Great job, I want you to do it again." And they go again and gather 4 barrels of water. And they begin to pour it out all over again. The wood, the stones, the sacrifice. And then he does something unbelievable, and he calls for it to happen the 3rd time. And by the time that the 4 barrels are poured out the 3rd time, everything's saturated. The wood is wet. How would it ever burn? The trench around the altar is now full to overflowing with water. You know what I believe Elijah was doing when he called for this to happen? I believe it was a form of worship for Elijah. I believe with all my heart that Elijah, Sister Dasa, had enough faith in God to do something that others would have laughed at and said, "You're crazy." I believe it was a form of worship, and it was Elijah's way of saying, "God, I know that you can do absolutely anything. I know what it may look like. I know how impossible the situation may seem. But God, I trust you enough to go to the extreme because I believe that you can show up in this situation, and I believe that you can do the impossible, the thing that nobody else thinks that you can do. Can I tell you tonight that when we get to the point that we go to extremes, that we believe God is able enough, that we go to extremes saying, God, I know that it looks impossible, but I'm going to do it anyhow because I believe that even in this mess, even in this possibility, God, that you are going to show up and that you are going to show yourself powerful and real, and all people, nobody will be able to discount what you are getting ready to do. And I think that Elijah was at that point that he was saying, God, show up. God, this is time for you to shine. Show up and do what only you can do. Too many times we become concerned with God's reputation that we try to help him out. God, we don't know if you can do it or not. So we're going to do what we can to, we want to save face for you, God. We make every excuse under the book. We're going to put a gas torch under the altar just in case that you can't do it. But what Elijah was saying as the water was being poured out, I believe Elijah was saying God can do absolutely anything. Anything. Everybody say anything. God can do anything. He can make the impossible possible. I'm going to make it as impossible as I can so I can get to the point that people will know without any doubt that you are the one true God and that you are going to come through. You're looking for him to just come down so often and ignite the sacrifice, but he's a lot bigger than just that. He's a lot more able than just that because he's able to do exceeding. He's able to go above and beyond anything. He will always exceed your expectations. You know the story. Elijah prays a little prayer and fire fell down. And the Bible says that the fire consumed everything. The sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and it lapped up the water in the trench. Should never have been possible. The dust on the ground was even consumed. Understand that the act of Elijah pouring the water on the altar had a very significant meaning. The water was a precious commodity at that point because it had not rained for 3 years. What was poured out on the sacrifice in abundance, God was going to in turn pour out an unmeasurable amount. All because somebody said that I'm going to stretch my faith because I believe, God, that you're going to see me through. I'm going to do something that nobody is expecting. And it was just because of that 6 verses later that Elijah is recording as saying, I hear the sound of abundance of rain. That is what I'm talking to us about this evening. He was willing to do something that stretched him and stretched his faith. And when he did, God responded by pouring out an abundance of rain, more than was needed. Our desires must be for more than what we just need to survive. Our desires have got to be, God, give us an abundance. I don't want just enough to live one more day. I want enough that will see me through the rest of my life. And why do I want that? It's not selfish reasons that I just bless me, bless me, bless me. No, I want an abundance. I want an abundance that begins to overflow. And when it begins to overflow, it begins to flow to the next person, and it flows from them to the next person. And that person may be going through the fight of their life, and they may be at the point of just giving in and throwing in the towel. And it may just be the only thing that they are able to survive from is the abundance that God has given me. We got to quit being selfish about it and saying, God, just give me. But God, just give me an abundance so that I can in turn be a blessing to someone else. It was less than a week before Jesus' crucifixion. He was in Simon the leper's house. And while he sat there at the table, a woman came and broke an alabaster box. And she began to pour this precious ointment that the Bible said cost her a year's wages. Think about how much money you make a year. And everything that you would have would be wrapped up in one alabaster box. The Bible said that she approached Jesus and she broke it. Others around her thought, what in the world is she doing? The Bible says that she began to pour the oil on the head of Jesus. And imagine what would happen. It would begin to run down his face and his beard, his clothes. He would be saturated. She began to pour it. It was extravagant worship for her. A drop or two would have filled the room with the fragrance, but she did not limit him to just a small portion, but she gave him everything that she possessed. Though worth a year worth of wages, she wasn't willing to keep anything back for herself. And so unexpected was the act that it took everybody by surprise. What in the world is she doing? Why? This is so wasteful. What does she hope to gain from it? I don't know what she was thinking. We can surmise what she was thinking, but all I can tell you is this, that for over 2,000 years, this woman has been an example that has been talked about countless times. This is a principle that would be repeated and followed over the years. Jesus said, wherever the gospel is preached, you're going to read, you're going to hear about this abundant praise that was poured out me. It wasn't just a little bit. It wasn't enough that would just last a day. And I'm sure that when days later, when he was at the whipping post, or maybe when he was hanging on the cross, days later, I imagine that he could still smell the remnants of her praise as it soaked into his skin. It was extravagant. It was beyond understanding. But I want to tell you, that is how we learn to live in abundance. There's nothing in it for me at all. But I'm going to take it and I'm going to allow it to overflow in my life and allow it to flow out. We will never be effective soul winners, no matter how much we are convinced or convicted, rather, about winning our city. It's not how sorry we are. It's not how convicted we are. And I pray that God gives all of us such a strong burden. But can I tell you that being burdened alone is not enough? It is the abundance of God's blessing to us. It's living in the overflow. It's when we are no longer satisfied with just crying about it and wishing that there was something that we can do. It's when we had enough of that and we get up from where we are and we do something about it. When we can't wait to tell somebody what Jesus has done for me. When we can't wait to tell somebody I was hopeless and I was lost. I was a sinner. I was undone. I no longer look like what I've been through and where I came from. But I too was there. But I have hope, and you too can have hope. I have freedom, and you can have freedom too. We are much more effective when we are happy and we're blessed and we are living in abundance. David said it like this: my cup runneth over. I'm talking about the principle of abundance. When our cup runs over and what is in us begins to flow out of us. Stand with me. John 7:38 says that he believed on me, as the scripture said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. Abundance. Everybody say abundance. There is no abundance in the Dead Sea. In fact, they tell us it's dying, it's drying up. The goodness and the joy and the satisfaction in our lives is linked to what we allow to flow from us. You can come to church with the intent of allowing God to pour into you, but you can do that and never learn to allow what you have been filled with to flow out of you. And when you do that, you will eventually die spiritually. You can die, yes, in the midst of abundance. Allow me to clarify and tell you that you cannot give what you do not possess. That will cause spiritual bankruptcy when you begin to give what you don't have. We've got to learn to tap into abundance. But if it's just about us and what He can do for us, we will soon find ourselves empty, because we have to learn to open ourselves up to the source and allow the source to flow out of us. Because God designed each one of us to be a conduit. Not a dam, but a conduit through which abundance flows. The more that we open ourselves up to allow abundance to flow out, the more that flows in that God will bless. Jesus said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. How many want to live an abundant life? Not for selfish reasons, not because it just makes us feel good or just what I can get, but because that we can bless others through the blessings that God has given us. Would you just raise your hands in this place tonight? And would you pray a prayer and say, God, help me to get this principle. Help me to understand that it's through abundance. Not what's in it for me, God. Not what I can keep for myself, but what I can give to others. What I can allow to flow out of me that will affect somebody else's life. God, help us to get this principle tonight. Help us to not be selfish, God. Help us to not keep things to ourselves. Help us not to be concerned only with what we get out of it. But God, help us to be concerned with what we can give others through it. God, challenge us. Open our minds.